Hello, my name is Guy Lancaster, editor of the Encyclopedia of Arkansas website, which is a project of the Central Arkansas Library System. We're based in the Bobby L. Roberts Library for Arkansas History and Art, located in downtown Little Rock across Rock Street from the main library, which also houses the galleries at Library Square and the Butler Center for Arkansas Studies. The Roberts Library Research Room and the galleries at Library Square are now open on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays from 9 to 11 and 1 to 5. The early time slot is set aside exclusively for high-risk populations. Like other CALS branches, we're limiting the number of patrons in the building at one time. We ask that you call ahead to make an appointment to reserve your spot in the research room or the galleries at Library Square. For patrons wishing to use our closed stacks materials, you must request your items at least 2 business days in advance. Please go to robertslibrary.org for all the specifics before planning your visit. For the details about other CALS branches, the days and times they are open, please go to cals.org, cals.org, or call the specific branch. We're doing a lot of virtual programming for the foreseeable future. Library programs include story times, cooking classes, craft activities, and podcasts. You can find most of these programs archived on CAL's YouTube channel. Just go to youtube.com and search for the Central Arkansas Library System. Subscribe to the channel to get notification when the latest videos are posted. And please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, if you will. The speakers tonight will answer questions at the end of this session. Please type your questions in the chat box in Zoom. If you have tech questions or issues, let us know and we'll try to help you out. Now, today's program. The worldwide demonstrations against white supremacy that followed the murder of George Floyd earlier this year drew attention to the deep history of race and violence in the United States and beyond. At the same time, these demonstrations raised the question, where do we go from here and how do we achieve a future in which reconciliation and restoration finally become a reality for all peoples? To offer their own insights based upon exhaustive research upon the subject are three scholars and writers who have this very year published books tackling these issues. They are, first, Barclay Key, assistant professor at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock, and author of Race and Restoration, Churches of Christ and the Black Freedom Struggle. Second is Brian Mitchell, assistant professor at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock, and co-author of the revised edition of Blood in Their Eyes, the Elaine Massacre of 1919. Wrapping us up is J. Chester Johnson, poet, essayist, and translator, and author of Damaged Heritage, the Elaine Race Massacre and a Story of Reconciliation. These presenters will discuss their recent books and engage in dialogue with the public and with each other on the steps that are necessary to fulfill the promise of equality here in the state of Arkansas and beyond. If you want to order any of their books, we'll be posting links to their publishers and personal websites in the chat. Also, I just heard today that a group of descendants of the victims of the Elaine Massacre have organized a few events for next month. If anyone representing that group is watching this, please feel free to post some information about your events in the chat so that we can share it with the wider audience. Now, first up is Barclay Key. Barclay grew up in Moulton, Alabama, and earned a degree in history from the University of North Alabama. While working as a high school history teacher, he finished a Master's of Divinity at David Lipscomb University, and later earned an MA and a PhD in history from the University of Florida. He joined the history department at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock in 2012, and aside from his book, has published chapters in the anthologies Painting Dixie Red, When, Where, Why, and How the South Became Republican, and Destination Dixie, Tourism and Southern History. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Barclay Key.
Thank you, Guy. Can you hear me okay? All right, great. So I want to thank Central Arkansas Library System for inviting me to this event and give me this opportunity to talk about my book. And so my goal is just to talk about how I became interested in this topic and then provide an overview of what the book contains and perhaps entice a few people to give it a look. So the first question, how did I get interested in this topic? I grew up in rural Alabama and in a very devout Church of Christ household. And so my interests in race and religion go back pretty far, but I discovered as a young adult that a lot of white Christians were opposed to the civil rights movement, and particularly many of the leaders who were Black clergymen. And so I had this interest in the ways that race and religion intersected, especially in the South. And so when I went to graduate school, I started looking for a dissertation topic. And at that point, sort of the first step in finding a topic is determining what's already out there, what people have already written. And at this point, I learned that many of the major denominations already had studies. And I want to take a moment to mention that, especially for people who are part of a predominantly white church, that there are books out there that you can read about the Southern Baptist Convention, the Methodist Church, the Presbyterians. And I really encourage you to pick those up and look at them. I watched another panel a few weeks ago and someone said, why hasn't somebody written on these topics? And they actually have. And there's some really good books. And so I sort of situated myself on the backs of those authors who'd already researched these more prevalent denominations. But I did the Church of Christ because no one had studied them, and because I was already familiar with their theology, having grown up in that denomination. And so if you don't know about the Churches of Christ, I want to just say a quick word about their history and then describe more about the book. So the denomination grew out of a revivalist strain of Christianity in the US during the 19th century. And that particular strain sought to unify all these different competing denominations, especially on what was then the American frontier. The idea was that, hey, we shouldn't be Baptists or Methodists or Presbyterians. We should all just unify behind one church. We're one body, one Christianity. And over time, this particular strain had developed a basis for that unity, and that was restoring Christianity as it was practiced in the New Testament. And so they would even use this phrase, New Testament Christianity, or restoring New Testament Christianity. And so thus the title of my book, Race and Restoration. Now, a few denominations developed out of this particular strain, but Churches of Christ prevailed across the Mid-South especially. So northern Alabama, middle and western Tennessee, north and central Arkansas, East Texas. That's where most Churches of Christ were located, and still that's the case today. Now, over time, these Christians who had initially started out trying to unify a variety of denominations, they came to believe that they had restored New Testament Christianity at some level. And excuse me, if they had restored it, then other people should be joining their church, right? And so this theological bent eventually gave way to a degree of sectarianism and exclusivism. If we've restored the New Testament church, then everyone, black and white, should join it. And so this theology facilitated a measure of interracialism that was uncharacteristic across the South. Most church members were white. That was always the case. That was still the case. But a sizable percentage of the church was also consisted of black members. Also, one other point that's important to understand is there was no formal hierarchy. So in that sense, it was a local churches controlled their own activities. They made decisions for themselves. There was no annual convention. There were no bishops in another city that gave direction about what to do. Churches of Christ were locally autonomous. And so with that background, my book examines what this particular restorationist denomination looked like amid all of the changing racial mores of the 20th century. And Guy, I hope it's okay. You invited us to read excerpts from our books. And so I'm going to read just a brief bit from the introduction that I think encapsulates the most important contribution that my book makes. So I'm on page 4. When racial identities were subordinated under the guise of Christian unity, blacks and whites interacted with surprising frequency in the segregated South, based on their perception of Churches of Christ as the true church that stood in opposition to the denominations. While other Protestant churches formed what amounted to racially exclusive denominations or administrative districts, Churches of Christ did not, because they understood themselves as the only authentic expression of Christianity. Within this context, and with few exceptions, white supremacy remained largely unchallenged. Whites preached against racial prejudice and offered support to black churches, preachers, and schools, but whites also maintained segregated colleges in the South until the 1960s and generally ignored the pervasive racial discrimination that characterized life in the United States. So those few sentences, I think, encapsulate what's important here, that among Churches of Christ, there were these competing identities involving race because of the pervasive culture of white supremacy, but also involving their personal faith, in which they genuinely believed that they had restored New Testament Christianity. And so with that, the book is organized into 6 chapters, and the first 2 chapters examine black and white churches and what they were saying and doing about race relations, especially in the early part of the 20th century. So one fascinating source base that I used involves Sunday school lessons. So it was interesting to go back and read Sunday school lessons and discover some about race relations. And of course, they picked up passages from the Bible and examined them in Sunday school classes and discussed discrimination. They discussed segregation. And so it's fascinating to get a look at what white churches in particular were saying about those topics. The third chapter is about desegregation of Church of Christ colleges. And that chapter features Harding University and Abilene Christian University in Abilene, Texas. And so Harding's a strong Arkansas connection, of course. There's probably some alumni in the audience today. And so that chapter really focuses on those two institutions and the ways in which desegregation evolved separately from the history of public school desegregation or public college desegregation. And it's a fascinating story. A lot of white college students were advocates of desegregation, even in the 1940s, before some of the momentous Supreme Court rulings that would come in the late 40s and 1950s. But administrators were generally reticent to desegregate. And even as the 60s unfolded, when desegregation finally occurred, there were gradations of racial attitudes among white church members. Students might be okay with a Black student in the same classroom, but they might reject sharing a dorm room with a Black student. Chapter 4 is about Churches of Christ in the Civil Rights Movement. And as you probably picked up on what I've said so far, if Churches of Christ believe themselves to be the only authentic expression of Christianity, then these other denominations and their preachers who are involved in social activism were looked down upon. They were rejected. And so Churches of Christ, both Black and white, generally avoided civil rights activism. There were a few exceptions, a few notable exceptions, but in general, the civil rights movement unfolded separate from the world of Churches of Christ. But having said that, within the denomination, there were intense arguments about Black preachers advocated for themselves, for Black students to be admitted to predominantly white colleges, for churches to have integrated services, or maybe to just integrate into one church. And so that dialogue, especially since it's separate from the more familiar national dialogue about the civil rights movement, was really fascinating to read. The last two chapters are about the ways in which the denomination tried to reconcile both among different churches, but also among institutions within the church. And there were disjointed efforts to pursue racial reconciliation that were fascinating, including merging churches. So there were a number of occasions that I discovered where a town had a Black Church of Christ and a white Church of Christ, and they made a conscious decision to merge into one church. And so I think those are fascinating stories to investigate as we seek to further understanding of that time period in US history. So I mentioned a few of my sources. I'll mention a few more. I mentioned the Sunday school literature, but sermons are featured prominently. Letters to the editor were also really fascinating, and that's one of the best ways that I got a lot of lay voices, was to read letters to the editor of these Church of Christ periodicals, both Black and white members writing about their interactions, about the revivals that they held, the preachers. As the cover of my book shows, one of the most prominent, probably the most prominent preacher within the church was Black, and he attracted both Black and white audiences at his revivals. And so there are a lot of fascinating stories along those lines. Student newspapers were also important at the Church of Christ colleges, and maybe the most fascinating documents were letters sent to a radio program. Churches of Christ had a radio program called the Herald of Truth in the 1950s and 1960s, actually into the 1970s. And in 1968, that program had a series of sermons about race relations. And they were generally mild, nothing surprising in them. Treat people well, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, the basic stuff. But the correspondence poured in, and much of it was pleading for guidance. One of my favorite letters was written by a woman in Kansas who she's a white woman, and she had a child in public schools who was friend with Black kids, and they wanted to come to her house. Her kid wanted to go to their house. She thought it was fine. Her mother-in-law was really upset about it, and so she's asking for advice about how to proceed. I want to close with the last paragraph of the book, since I know reconciliation was in the title of this evening's program. In the wake of the momentous changes of the 1960s, Churches of Christ were one of the few denominations that actually made conscious efforts to integrate individual local congregations. This practice was not widespread, But those rare occasions when churches merged or labored to incorporate people from a variety of ethnic backgrounds have much to teach about the racial perspectives of some church members who defined church unity in theological, ethnic, and practical terms. Churches of Christ long acknowledged the theological unity of their denomination, even if that unity never required fully integrated houses of worship. In churches that made conscious decisions to pursue diverse members, however, one finds the rare occasion where words are met with deeds. Given this outcome, it is little wonder that subsequent generations have become increasingly cynical about faith questions, the race question, and the denomination's answers to them. And I just want to close by saying I've got some reactions to the book. They've generally been positive. It's been fascinating to talk to family members who were mentioned in the book, both good and ill. So I've had some great discussions so far, and I look forward to answering whatever questions I can in a moment. Thanks, Guy.
All right, thank you, Barclay. And I've been informed that I accidentally introduced you as an assistant professor rather than an associate professor. So I do apologize for that. Next up is Dr. Brian Mitchell. He's a native of New Orleans, Louisiana, and earned a PhD in urban studies from the University of New Orleans. Brian worked for several years as an investigator for the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission before joining the history department at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock full-time in 2005. Aside from the Elaine Massacre, he has researched the 1859 expulsion of free blacks from Arkansas and the consequences of urban renewal in Little Rock. He is also author of a forthcoming graphic novel on the life of Oscar J. Dunn, the first black man to serve as an acting governor in the United States, and was named a visionary Arkansan by the Arkansas Times in 2008. Brian, I turn things over to you.
Thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to be here and welcome one and all. I came to Blood in Their Eyes via an emergency, and that emergency was Hurricane Katrina. I found myself without a home and without a place to work and a lot of time on my hands. So I went up to my wife's family to visit, and I began reading some history books on Arkansas. And one of the first ones I ran across was the first edition of Blood in Their Eyes by Griff Stockley. And what initially amazed me about Blood in Their Eyes is that the massacre took place roughly 8 hours away from New Orleans. And I had never heard of it outside of seeing it listed on the list of riots and massacres that took place in 1919. After reading the book, and as one of my professors always said, you should leave a book with lots of questions. He said, if it's a good book, you should walk away from it with lots and lots of questions. And those questions were sidelined briefly until I began teaching full-time at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock. When I came on, we were about 3 years out from the centennial celebration or commemoration of the event and the reconciliation process that was going on in Helena. And we decided, and I say we, myself, Griff Stockley, Guy Lancaster, Barclay Key, and a host of others in Helena and Elaine began looking at the Elaine Massacre again to see what hadn't been discovered and what was missing, where were the empty spaces. And to my surprise, we were able to find lots of information that hadn't been uncovered. And as we began accumulating more and more of this information, we made it readily available to people in the academic community and people who were interested in the commemoration of the event. But we also decided that it was time to sort of update what was in Blood in Their Eyes. And present some of this new information to the general public. Some of the new information that's provided in the text are the names of all, for the first time, a complete listing of all the sharecroppers who were arrested and sentenced that were part of the Progressive Household Workers Union. Members who were part of the American Legion Hall that comprised the first group or posse or mob that went out and arrested the Union members. Alternative takes on what happened at Hoopsburg. We were able to find documents that showed that the plantation owners were quite aware of the union's organization. So the story that had been perpetuated that the police had by happenstance made their way there was totally false, and that not only were they aware of the union, they had spies that had infiltrated the union and were taking names and were making people in the community aware that Blacks were organizing for trouble. We were able to identify one of these spies, or potentially one of these spies that had infiltrated the union. And we discussed how we were able to come to that revelation about that particular sharecropper that was a part of the union. Outside of that, one of the biggest questions that I got as we did research and as I began community discussions in both Helena and Elaine was what happened to the 12 after they completed their prison sentences, after they were released. And I began that as a project with students where we began investigating the lives of the 12 after their release and where they were located, where they were buried, and what sort of participation in the communities that they moved to. What were they doing there? Probably the most surprising revelation is that one of them became a gangster, and that hasn't set well with a lot of people. But when you're brought that close to a life or death situation where you're on death row, many of the men, although they stay on the straight and narrow when they're released from prison, at least one of them decides he's going to make the most of his life. And if that's in the criminal world, then so be it. The book itself is not, in fact, it's on sale for those of you who are considering purchasing the book. It's on sale right now at the University of Arkansas Press. But the book itself, we did not change very much of the court case. We felt as though Griff Stockley had done such a beautiful job describing the case of the 12 and how Scipio Jones works the case all the way to the Supreme Court. We felt as though there was very little new information that we could discover there. But as far as the lives of the other individuals, a wealth of information was discovered and a wealth of new primary documents were brought forth. I invite all of you to read it, and thank you very much for giving me a few moments of your time.
All right, thank you, Brian. Next up is J. Chester Johnson. Chester Johnson spent his youth in southeastern Arkansas and was educated at Harvard College and the University of Arkansas. He is the author of several poetry collections and served with renowned poet W.H. Auden on the drafting committee for the retranslation of the Psalms, which is the version contained in the current edition of the Book of Common Prayer of the Episcopal Church. For over 3 decades, in addition to his writing, Johnson owned and ran a financial advisory firm that concentrated on debt management for states, large local governments, and public authorities. He also served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Treasury Department under Jimmy Carter. Johnson currently lives in New York City. If you'd like a signed book plate for your copy of Damaged Heritage, please contact Chester through his personal website, jchester.com. I've posted a link to that site in the chat. And so with that, we will turn it over to Chester.
Thank you, Guy. Can you hear me all right? Okay, good. Good evening. I'm J. Chester Johnson, and I'm delighted to be with you tonight to talk about my latest book. On May the 5th, Damaged Heritage, The Elaine Race Massacre, and a Story of Reconciliation was released, published by Pegasus and distributed by Simon & Schuster. A month ago, I was informed that Damaged Heritage had become an Amazon bestseller for biographies of social activists. While the South may carry a more glaring history of damaged heritage and its effects on racial subjugation, let us not be misled. Damaged heritage is a national problem, and wherever its use by whites against African Americans exists, then this book applies. I was asked to write the Litany of Offense and Apology for the National Day of Repentance, October the 4th, 2008, when the Episcopal Church formally apologized, with the presiding bishop officiating, for its role in Atlantic slavery and related evils. As I conducted my research, I came across a 70-page treatise entitled The Arkansas Race Riot, written by the African-American historian and anti-lynching advocate Ida B. Wells. It told of a terrible slaughter of Black sharecroppers and their family members, possibly the worst attack against African Americans in our country's history, with over 100 and possibly hundreds of Blacks perishing in Phillips County, located in southeast Arkansas along the Mississippi River Delta. I grew up in southeast Arkansas, one county removed from the site of the massacre. None of my friends nor I ever knew a thing about this terrible event. I never heard about it at school, in social gatherings, at church. As I was to discover, for virtually everyone in the United States, the Elaine Race Massacre didn't exist as a murderous act in American history. Partially out of sheer anger that I had been duped by the evanescence of uncomfortable history, I began to examine attacks in southeast Arkansas against African Americans around the time of the Elaine Race Massacre after the end of World War I, and found that there had been lynchings and burnings of Blacks alive in the area, but none of these horrific and pernicious acts resulted in the 100+ deaths that occurred in the Elaine Race Massacre. I also began to recall a crucial personal story my mother told me many years before about my maternal grandfather, Lonnie Birch, the principal caretaker during the first 5 years of my life. She told me that when she was young, not yet a teenager, Lonnie, who had been a member of the Ku Klux Klan, participated in what she called a well-known race riot, where many Blacks were killed in southeast Arkansas. Over time, I concluded that the Elaine Race Massacre and the well-known race riot my mother relayed to me about my grandfather were one and the same. 5 years after the Episcopal Church apologized for its role in slavery and related evils, I wrote a 10,000-word article for a literary magazine on the massacre, which started a journey to reconciliation and deep friendship with Sheila Walker, a descendant of African Americans who were victims of the conflagration in Phillips County. She wrote the foreword to Damaged Heritage. At that time, I also learned something disturbing about myself through the writing of that article. Notwithstanding the preponderance of facts and evidence that Lonnie had participated in the massacre, I used the term likely to describe his role. I had no excuse to use the ameliorative word likely. My use of the term ultimately caused me to explore ways white Americans have frequently reacted to their collective and individual damaged heritage that has brought subjugation to Blacks over generations and several centuries. As a result of this personal challenge, I came to uncover the ability of generations of whites to tolerate the terrible treatment of Blacks in America. I acknowledged my attempt, as so many American whites, especially large numbers of white Southerners, had done before me, to lessen the effects of damaged heritage for the perpetrators. White folks have shielded themselves from damaged heritage through the adoption of an excessive veneration of ancestors, the past, and traditions, a feature Webster calls filiopiatism. Both damaged heritage and filiopiatism taken together are serious components of long-term and continuing racism. In fact, the influence of damaged heritage on white racism bears little potent capability without the psychological cover from filiopiatism, which has excused, camouflaged, and sufficiently inoculated damaged heritage throughout our national history. We humans are not born with racism as a natural result of who we innately are. Rather, it is a trait we absorb as a condition of what we learn and have to unlearn if we are to free ourselves from this evil. I like to think that the commonality between all humans, let's call this commonality the genuinely human, far outweighs any differences in custom, history, background, skin color, accents, language, manners, and rituals. Unfortunately, meager differences in these facets between us have often suggested to many whites the perfect reason for exclusion, separation, and isolation of others. With the genuinely human in mind, I recall comments for guidance from the philosopher Soren Kierkegaard, who wrote 170 years ago that one generation does not learn anything genuinely human from a past generation. In other words, we have to learn ever anew for ourselves the genuinely human, which certainly proved to be the prevailing feature leading to the last 6 years of my reconciliation and friendship with Sheila Walker, descendant of Elaine victims. Kierkegaard's view that one generation cannot rely on a previous generation to learn the genuinely human warns us that filiopiatism must and will inevitably embrace racism in white America's case, since that revered past cast African Americans in a perpetual state of human subjugation. Therefore, we whites have to be especially careful today about those traditions to which we adhere, for if we're not, they will surely, as they have in the past, contain racist experience and justification brought forward again and again. I believe that my forebears, and probably most all white forebears in similar circumstances, realized the evil and sin they were committing. In fact, I don't think most American whites over generations could tolerate imposing the subjugation and severe repression that they inflicted on African Americans through the application of damaged heritage. Only the inoculation and remarkable cover provided by filiopiatism allowed such subjugation and repression to continue. Of course, excessive reverence and adherence to the past do not just exist in the South, though numerous Northerners have often preferred to think of it that way. It's also located in all white churches. in local judicial, economic, and political systems biased against African Americans, and simply in the rooted ways that things have been. And yet we whites do not comprehend what our racism against African Americans and all of its various forms has done to us and taken from us. Indeed, the greatest American filiopiatist of them all, William Faulkner, who brought past mythologies current as much as anyone and who coined the line, "The past is never dead, it's not even past," saw the terrible connection and impact of damaged heritage and filiopietism, writing, quote, "No man can cause as much grief as that one clinging blindly to the vices of his ancestors," close quote. Are there traditions we whites now blindly adopt that directly or indirectly endorse racism and thus project the power and the existence of those traditions for tomorrow? Notwithstanding this very prospect, we should nonetheless feel eagerly challenged that we alone can open ourselves to the genuinely human, not bound by those who come before, and certainly not binding us to past racism. Since Lonnie remained for me divided between my beloved grandfather and a person who participated in the massacre, Sheila proved to be a godsend. She circumvented my struggles with the ribbon composite of Lonnie's two personas by announcing, both publicly in groups like this one and privately to my family and me, that she forgave Lonnie more than I had. By forgiving Lonnie for his role in the Phillips County conflagration that produced attacks against her victimized ancestors, she deflated the potency of the damaged part of my tradition. Still, notwithstanding the acknowledged power of forgiveness, we whites aren't so much into forgiveness, even the acceptance of forgiveness, which I believe is necessary for racial reconciliation. But we always knew within ourselves that we could only be cleansed by those we had made our victims, Black brothers and sisters among us. By so many measures, we whites must depend on African Americans to help guide us in a direction that will also allow us to forgive the what and who that have defined us in ways we often do not yet admit, and for so many, unfortunately, still choose to admire. More particularly, the use of forgiveness elevates African Americans and at the same time releases whites to be free of their traditional commissions, to turn whites from their historical inheritance and participation in evil. Racial reconciliation means the making of color irrelevant to all facets of our lives, economically, socially, spiritually. I propose we bring this idea always into a fully human setting, into a setting in which we can relate to the genuinely human possibility. Simply put, to ourselves. Dealing with the special nature of race, we too often assign much of our own individual context to institutions, forsaking prospects we know we otherwise can bring entirely to bear between individual Blacks and whites. If we Blacks and whites are not allies personally and individually, then we can't be true allies generally. While there is no doubt greater white activism at all levels is needed today in responding to racist episodes and comments, racial reconciliation is biracial. aligned with personally intense involvement. It is time for institutions to break open and free individuals of goodwill, Black and white, to find each other in missions that result in authentic and public expressions for the genuinely human, depending instinctively on each other for the context, sentiments, and humanity to circumvent obstacles embedded in so many past ways and habits. I've occasionally let myself lean into the following possibilities. What if we whites allowed ourselves to pursue and fully embrace the genuinely human, accepting the commonality of all human beings, superseding and obviating those marginal facets such as accent, skin color, customs, and the like that American whites have used to segregate themselves from Blacks? And if all of that could happen, shouldn't we be able to mitigate, if not contain, the long-living influence of filiopiatism with its excessive reverence for ancestors, the past, and tradition? And if that were to happen, how could damaged heritage survive from generation to generation? And if we could add a little forgiveness, exercised by African Americans, the equivalent of what Martin Luther King Jr. called the weapon of love, and if we whites could accept that forgiveness from African Americans, the kind of forgiveness that Sheila showed Lonnie, or the kind of forgiveness that the families of those killed at Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston showed to the white killer, Dylan Roof, isn't it possible that, dare I say it, we can contemplate something beyond, something over the mountaintop in visions like those of King and Isaiah that speak gently to us all about one to another, Black to white, and white to Black? Thank you.
All right, thank you, Chester. We are now opening up for questions, and the first one is, have any of you faced any challenges getting descendants of the Elaine massacre or anyone from the Elaine community to speak with you or participate in any research, etc.? If you have, can you explain your experience? Who wants to tackle that one first?
I think Brian's done more work on that than I have. I can comment on it, but probably Brian Mitchell's done more on that than I have.
I spent a lot of time in both Elaine and the surrounding area in Helena. And I spoke to various segments of the populations throughout the county. And what I can say about the massacre is that there are Blacks who still live in fear in Phillips County. They live in fear that if they ask too many questions, that they might lose their jobs. If they ask too many questions, that they might be blackballed in their communities. There are whites who, in that community, who are deniers, that say that if you can't show me a body, then it never happened. In fact, at a recent conference, there was a gentleman who yelled in the back, "Show me a body, show me a body, show me a body," repetitively, as if the absence of those remains somehow forgives the acts of atrocity that were committed. There are some whites that fear the potential liability or the social scrutiny that an investigation or any discussion of the topic would bring to them and their families. And that's what's unusual about that is at many of them, there were many of events around this topic over the last 3 years. And overwhelmingly, they were events that were attended by African Americans. Not to say that there were no whites that attended them, but overwhelmingly African Americans attended them. And when whites attended, the whites that were attending were people like Chester. Chester, has come to grips with the reality of the event, that it occurred, that his ancestor had participated in it, and he's able to separate the event from the man that he knew. Many people have not done that, however. Many people cannot separate that their grandfather that taught them to ride a bike may have also participated in the heinous killing of their Black neighbors. And that's much too much, for those individuals to deal with. So they just avoid the topic.
Let me, if I may, I'd like to add one comment. Well, when I was writing my book, I did interview a number of people in Phillips County. And I'll emphasize a couple of things that Brian mentioned. And in that involves a number of deniers who have some ancestors going back to the white planters. But it's not consistent. It was very interesting. As I was doing my work, out of the blue, I get contacted by a person who lives outside the state, but is sort of one generation back from the current. I mean, he's in his 20s and 30s, and he contacted me, and he wanted to make it very clear as I was writing my book that his position was entirely different than the positions of the two preceding generations of which he knew. And he made it very clear that he was aware of what happened and that it wasn't a way in which it had been portrayed to him. And I thought that was quite interesting, that there was a breakage in that family's views on exactly what happened. In addition, I found that two quick points. One is that there was some fear in the white community that if, to the extent that people were stirring it up, that there were going to be vengeful reactions, possibly from the Black community. And but then on the other hand, there was fear among certain Blacks that the current environment was not, that was more extreme in 1919, but the current environment had certain similarities to that did exist back in at the conclusion of World War I, and they could talk about that. So
Okay, got a question for Barclay. How is the structure of the Churches of Christ implicated in the continuation of racism? That is, doesn't the idea of local autonomy allow people to not take responsibility for the organization as a whole?
I guess the short answer would be yes, but then simultaneously it allows some people to forge a path that might be radically different for some. I had a fascinating conversation on Sunday. I did a Zoom call with an extended family who wanted to talk about the book. And so someone, in the course of conversation, we sort of came to that agreement that this absence of a hierarchy enabled some churches to pursue integration or racial reconciliation in ways that it might not would have in other denominations, while at the same time, the institutions, especially the colleges, probably desegregated much more slowly than they might would have otherwise if there had been a hierarchy sort of dictating that desegregation occur.
Okay. We have a fairly broad question here. What are the most pressing specific policies in Arkansas that we can address to aid in establishing equity? Does anyone want to take a stab at that?
I have a very long list. But there are some really basic things if we're going to talk about the ways that white supremacy are pervasive today. Look no further than the Little Rock School District, which is 67 to 80% students of color. And for 5 years, it's been controlled by white men making 6 figures with no experience in education. That's a basic one. We have a tax structure in this state that continually awards people who are extremely wealthy, but we can barely afford to keep schools open. Hey, it would be great if the library system and archives had more resources to digitize more materials that our audience and other historians could do investigations for themselves. Those are 2 that just pop in my mind, Guy, but you know me well enough to know that I've got a long list.
Brian or Chester want to add to that list?
We can't talk about equity and justice without talking about the communities that we live in. And education being an integral part, housing being another part. But we have to create pathways for opportunities for children that are growing up in these communities and access to resources that are comparable to the communities of wealth. But without that, what we are is abandoning children to the same fate that their parents and grandparents suffered in. If you're interested in plans that have been discussed in the region, there was a fair housing and equity plan that was put together in 2012, and it should be at the library. So look under Metro Plan, Fair Housing and Equity. And there was an equity assessment, an assessment of Central Arkansas as far as equity across the region. And it looked at the poorest neighborhoods in the region, which we call racially concentrated areas of poverty, and the obstacles that are faced by the residents in those communities. And those communities are subjected to food deserts. They're subjected to environmental hazards. They're subjected to the worst schools in the district. So we want to believe that America is a meritocracy where everybody can succeed, but we know already that the playing field is not a level playing field.
I don't have anything to add, Guy.
Okay. Here's another. Hi, I'm a citizen of Elaine, born and raised. My question is, in terms of reconciliation for the Elaine descendants of the 1919 massacre, what does reconciliation consist of for the Elaine descendants? How do you accurately know what needs are needed when there's not one book that teaches what it's like when the cameras aren't recording and you have to live your life daily here in Elaine, speaking in terms of continued racism from the events that continue to haunt many citizens here in Elaine?
I'll try that, if I may. Reconciliation can mean a lot to, can mean different things to different people. The reconciliation that I've experienced with Sheila Walker, who was one of the descendants, and one of her ancestors was of Elaine 12. our reconciliation depended on a series of phases that started out with our determination of what we thought really happened, relying in part on the identification in South Africa of Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. They didn't say reconciliation and then truth. It's Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. And after that point, we really focused on the issues that I discussed, the what I consider the genuinely human, which exceeds those issues that I identified of custom, tradition, skin color, accent, language, traditions, all of that, and goes to something that is really much more fundamental and deeper, that can consist of reconciliation itself, to understand, to interpret, to love, if you will. And those issues that really are much more fundamental in terms of creating the commonality of humankind. And those are the things that we focused on in the process of our reconciliation, which has created an environment, quite frankly, where our families, our respective spouses, our children participate in this relationship. And we are really quite close. We had a Zoom birthday party 2 weeks ago for Sheila, and all family members, and we were part of it. And it's been a wonderful experience, and that would have not happened really I don't think, in the absence of the forgiveness that Sheila showed very early on for Lonnie, and Lonnie's his participation. I mean, she did it on the basis of two things. One, she fundamentally believes that a person is born good, but bad circumstances make good people do bad things. I don't know if I'm fully that hopeful and optimistic. She also really believes that Lonnie was a compassionate and hopeful person and loving person. Otherwise, I wouldn't have felt the way I did toward him. And but that he was caught up in the racism of his time. But going to the issue more specifically of relations, I probably, maybe I shouldn't even be commenting on it, but it just seemed to me about the local situation that Elaine has served as a shadow over the county for a long time. And that in my interviews, someone said to me, you know, we have swept Elaine under the rug, but for many years we keep stumbling over the rug. And there is just such I've detected, and it really breaks my heart, the kind of the relationship, the absence of reconciliation locally. And I just plead with the people not in Elaine in Phillips County to deal with this on a face-to-face basis. It's just Sheila and I spoke about reconciliation in April of 2017 in Phillips County, sponsored by the Delta Cultural Center. And it was both black and white, but primarily about 65% black and 35% white was the audience. But it was just palpable the absence of reconciliation that exists in the county. And I just, it's an area that I think someone needs to take. Maybe I'm speaking out of school, but that someone needs to aggressively pursue reconciliation locally. I mean, I'm very hopeful that memorial will lead toward that. I mean, it's a physical manifestation of recognition of what really happened. And I'm hopeful that memorial that was unveiled at the end of September 2019 will lead toward it. But a lot of work, I'm not from Phillips County, but I have to tell you, I felt it when all the times I was in Phillips County, the absence of reconciliation.
If I could speak for a moment, for me, reconciliation has three components to it. You can't have real honest reconciliation without some sort of repair for what has been damaged. If I burn your house and come and see you standing on the curb with nothing and tell you I'm sorry, you're still out of a house. And that sorry only goes so far to improving your situation. And the second component is truth-telling to me. Right now, what's being taught or what was taught to me in high schools around the country is a myth. Much of what we're learning as American history is a patriotic ideology that's being passed on, and or even in some of the better classrooms, omitted. There's large chunks of history that are just excluded. And a lot of the students that I get take my classes particularly because they don't see themselves in American history. And I can tell you horror stories of people who have come to me, students who say, I don't want to learn about Black people in US history. I don't want to learn about Chinese people in US history. I don't want to learn about anyone except for great white men. And that's not US history. That's a narrative of exceptionalism and white supremacy that's just been perpetuated over and over again. And the third component of that, and remember what I said first, repairing, truth-telling. The third component is a sincere apology. Are you making an apology to keep public face? Are you making an apology to try to win votes? Are you making an apology to stave off a request or for some liability, some claim of liability that the people that you've heard might make? So I believe that there are these three essential components to successful reconciliation. And without those three, it's sort of hollow what comes out next. We can't repair the damage that has been done in the United States by white supremacy just by saying I'm sorry. We can't repair the damage that's currently being done to the schools, to the children in public schools in Little Rock, just by saying I'm sorry 10 years from now. That's not going to fix anything.
And this I'll piggyback just real quickly, Guy.
Absolutely.
I'm sorry, but I want to agree with everything that Brian just said. The good book says, without repentance, there can be no forgiveness of sins. And to my mind, racial reconciliation starts with Ida Wells's list of people and the economic damage they suffered. She's got a very specific list. And someone with the time and resources could track down the descendants of those people, and we could go ahead and calculate a dollar figure, and the state, either the state of Arkansas or the federal government, should make reparations to those people immediately. I mean, that's something that can be done that has not been done yet.
I agree with you, Barclay. And not only could they do that immediately, because we know many of the descendants of the people who went to prison. We know the names of the people now, thanks to you. And the names of all of the men who went to jail and were sentenced unfairly because of this. But there are hundreds of people that we don't know the names of. And this is where the audience, the attendees, can be an active component of change in the region. I mean, you guys have to ask the governor to open a commission. If they can do it in Oklahoma, if they could do it in Florida to investigate what happened, where these remains, identify these people, and find out who their descendants are, we have to do it. We can't just sit around and say, well, we might never know who did it. We're not, no real resources are being expended by the state. Another point is liability. And the question of this is where liability lies. We know that some people were damaged and we know exactly who they are, but there are lots of people that are dead that we don't know who they are. And the question that I've been asked at conferences over and over again is who's liable for this? The state or individuals liable, or is the federal government liable? And definitely I could say the state and federal governments are definitively liable in this. They participated in it. They actively participated in sending people there, perpetrating the untruth, and making sure that the people who were put on trial did not receive a fair trial. So I believe that there's a lot that can be done. I think Barclay's exactly right, that it's just a question of whether we're going to devote our energies to actually seeking justice or whether we're going to look blindly in the other direction.
All right, and maybe Brian, you can speak to this. There's a question about if anyone has investigated land theft as relates to the Elaine massacre.
And actually, that is a very good question for Barclay, because his class actually had a project that kind of investigated property ownership in Phillips County. So I'll go ahead and pass the ball, and if he wants to pass it back to me, I'll take it. But he can take it.
I'm going to have to pass it back. Most of what we looked at was census records. And so they looked primarily at names between 1910 and 1920 and occupations. So I don't have any specific knowledge of property transactions, although you and I have discussed some sales that occurred in the wake of the massacre, but you probably remember more details than I.
What we can tell you is that in the 1910 census, there were not a lot of Black property owners showing up in that census. So one of the things that makes it very, very hard when you don't have very many Black property owners is, okay, if everyone's a sharecropper, then where are the claims that property is stolen coming from? Now, you have to remember that the city of Elaine is a fairly new town when it was created between the 1910 census and the 1920 census. So between those 10 years, Elaine is created. We know that most of the land was purchased by large landowners in that vicinity. But there is a contingent of the population that I've talked to in Elaine that maintains that war veterans came back home, used their money to purchase land, and they were immediately cheated out of this land after the massacre. Now, I have not seen any records that substantiate that. I would love if someone knows of it. Like I've invited people who have maintained that their family had land stolen to identify parcels of land that they owned, and research could be done on those specific parcels to see if, in fact, their families had owned them at some time. And no one has ever taken me up on that offer.
And I'll direct this one to Chester. There's a comment in the chat that putting the memorial in Helena deepened the divide in Phillips County, that it this commenter says it didn't help reconciliation or healing, that it was largely put there to boost the economy in Helena versus Elaine. And I was wondering if you could comment on that from your perspective, given your work with the memorial.
Sure. Well, first of all, the idea of a memorial as a physical representation of a place that is an acknowledgement of exactly or of what happened has become a pretty common approach to as an initial first step toward reconciliation throughout the South. I mean, there are both, for example, Equal Justice Initiative in Alabama has made it a priority to create markers and tablets to signify and to acknowledge that that's what happened in various locations throughout Alabama. In Georgia, that has also happened primarily as an action centralized in part by the Absalom Jones Center for Racial Healing in Atlanta. So what we did was not inconsistent, which has become a consensus view of that's absolutely not just a Southern view. I mean, if one goes to Germany, and it's quite acknowledged that various markers are shown wherever they can find that a Jewish family, for example, was or a Jewish person was killed as a result of the Holocaust, then a memorial, a marker will be shown there. I will take exception to the idea that it can create. The intention is not to create division by putting a monument there. In fact, our memorial in Phillips County, and yes, I served as co-chair of the Elaine Massacre Memorial Committee, and it was in support of the idea that I have described as growing in consensus throughout the South, but more locally, it was our intention to create something that reminds individuals on a continuing basis. I mean, I'm a writer, but words can be ephemeral in a way unless there's repetition of them. But a physical memorial reminds people constantly of what happened. And it reminds people to separate fact from fiction. Now, it's possible that it could be divisive in certain ways. I'm not in Phillips County. On the other hand, the vast documentation that shows the way in which people proceed or toward the acknowledgement and putting an event in the context of reality and creating a way in which to move forward. That memorials is a constantly important step toward that resolution.
We have gone over a little bit, so I'm going to conclude with one last question that I think all of you can comment on. We have an attendee who posts, Mr. Johnson, first, thank you so much for your acknowledgement of the massacre and for including a descendant of the Elaine 12, Sheila Walker, to write the foreword. To me, that is an important step toward reconciliation and healing. As a descendant, I thank you. And kind of building off this, I wonder too how important it is for scholars and writers not just to research these things from an academic perspective, but also to include descendants and those who still have a very personal tie to this history, include their perspectives within these studies. And we can start with you, Chester, and then go to Barclay and Brian.
Okay. Well, first of all, the first chapter of my book is called A Changing of America. And it is a recitation of the Elaine massacre and the case of Moore versus Dempsey that came afterwards. And but it is meant to be, as the title suggests, is a backdrop to a discussion of the relationship that developed between Sheila and me toward reconciliation, which is a fancy word for sort of friendship and abiding friendship, which we clearly have. But it's also a way in which allowed me to talk about race, which is, and racial issues, which became an important component. And the thing that brought us together, Sheila and me together, was the Elaine massacre. It would have been impossible for me to have written the book in the context of the relationship, this reconciliation, or the desire to move toward reconciliation of two people coming at it from our respective different positions of the two parties involved in that. And Sheila had spent years looking at this, reading about it, and I had come from my side, and it would have been impossible for me not to give significant, or for Sheila not to have an important role in this book. So, her writing the foreword was an intention for us together to show others that there is an ability for people whose relatives who had actually been, my grandfather was involved in the massacre. I wasn't involved, but it was part of my inheritance. And if I didn't deal with it, all I did was forced it into the future. And it would be impossible for me to write about that without Sheila's participation.
Barclay, would you like a stab at the question?
Maybe so. I mean, I certainly think it's necessary for historians and writers to consider all voices that are brought to bear on a particular topic. And so, I mean, the short answer is yes, absolutely, that's the case. More broadly, I'm really pessimistic, though. I see someone in the comments remarked that the memorial is not necessarily a first step toward reconciliation. And I'm probably more amenable to that view. I just don't see how that's reconciling. It could be a first step, but then I'd want to know what the second and third steps are. And perhaps my cynicism grows deep, but if I may for a moment read from Ta-Nehisi Coates's Between the World and Me, when he's talking about, when he refers to dreamers, he's referring to white people who have enjoyed the American dream, but are just now realizing that the American dream has often been built on the backs of Black citizens. He says, do not struggle for the dreamers, hope for them, pray for them if you're so moved, but do not pin your struggle on their conversion. The dreamers will have to learn to struggle themselves, to understand that the field for their dream, the stage where they have painted themselves white, is the deathbed of us all. The dream is the same habit that endangers the planet, the same habit that sees our bodies stowed away in prisons and ghettos.
All right, Brian, would you like to send us off?
Sure, I'd be happy to say final departing words. One of the things that was very interesting about participating in the commemorations, the various commemorations, is as a historian, I was not on any of the committees, none of the committees in Elaine and none of the committees in Helena. And this will be a case study in public history for years to come, how this was handled and whether it was healing or more divisive. What has been interesting from an outsider's perspective is the idea of boosterism, historic tourism, and the historical positions that the relative communities have played with one another. And this is one of the things that has been very, very delicate about the situation is what sort of voice do the people of Elaine have? And I study marginalized communities a lot. I study communities of color, is my everyday work. And the lack of voice that community felt it had reverberated throughout the whole process, the whole commemoration process. It was demands on the part of those descendants of sharecroppers that were in Elaine that they have more voice and more control. And much the same way as the sharecroppers 100 years before were asking for more autonomy and control over their lives and the destinies of their children. So I'm hoping that I'm a little bit, I say it like Baldwin did, I have to be optimistic because the other option is terrible. I have to believe that this is a starting point for us. I have to believe that as I write, that the people in Elaine aren't just abandoned farm implements. And in many ways, in my heart, I feel as though for years they have been abandoned as antiquated implements. They've been dehumanized, and when they were no longer of any utility, they were left to their own devices without land. And imagine growing up in an agrarian community where there's farmland totally around you, but no food stuff is being grown, nothing for your consumption. So I have to ask myself, as a public historian, how do we keep this going, and how do we bring some voice to those people? I mean, how do we truly do truth telling, and how do we actually repair the damage that has been done? And I meant it's going to take the governor and folks in DC to actually solve that. This isn't something that the people in Elaine could solve. This isn't their problem. They didn't create this problem. But I don't see an immediate resolution to it. I'm hopeful, but I don't see a way out of it.
Okay, and with that, we will wrap up tonight. We really appreciate all of you, Dr. Mitchell, Key, Chester Johnson. Appreciate you taking part in this. Again, I want to let everyone know that links to the publishers' websites for the books are in the chat. And Chester Johnson wants you to know you can order a signed book plate from him through his personal website. That link is also in the chat. I have the sense we could go on for hours and hours on this subject. And I appreciate all of you being willing not only to contribute, your hour, but, we went 30 minutes over. So I really do appreciate that. I know I'm not a night owl by any means. So I appreciate all of you being willing to stay up a little later than usual. There are comments on the chats. People are really appreciating this and continue to have some discussion. I imagine all of us will continue to have this discussion far into the future. For those interested, this will be archived on YouTube so that you can go and revisit this. Again, look at cals.org, go to robertslibrary.org, sign up for our newsletter and email blast to be informed of more events like this. And we wish all of you the best. Hope you are staying healthy and staying safe in this crazy time. Thank you very much. Thank you to all of our participants again, and thank you to everyone who viewed this webinar. We really appreciate your participation. Thank you very much and have a wonderful evening. Take care.